Alright, in this video, let's put another interesting game feature into place. And what we're going to do is we're going to address something called drum menu navigation.
Okay.
Now, up to this point, we haven't worried too much about menu navigation because we've been using a keyboard as our development testing input device. And so we've had no problems with having separate keys for up and down versus keys for all of our notes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you were using something like a Rock Band drum set, you wouldn't have such a luxury. You'd have your main drums set up, and you don't have very many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you need all of them to be in use in the game. But when you go into menu navigation, you don't want to have to go down to the little D-pad and use that for all of your menu navigation.
Yeah, I hate that little D-pad.
So what we're going to do in this video is set up a secondary map set for our input system that will let us contain an alternate binding set, an alternate button binding set for our drum or gamepad controller.
Right, another way to put it is that we're going to define two separate behaviors for our drums. If we're staring at a menu, we'll be able to tap on specific drums to go up and down the menu, just like hitting the up and down arrow keys in our keyboard. But when we're playing the game, then the drums will go back to just being regular drums. And the player will never just see the difference. It'll all happen behind the scenes.
Exactly, and since we can't find a button to do two separate things, we're going to use different input maps in order to handle this.
Let's set it up.
And we'll just make sure we change the maps out at the appropriate time. Alright, to get all this set up, we're going to modify the input configuration to allow different types of input. So we're going to jump up here on our content project and bring up our config XML file. Now, we do want to be efficient in reusing as many of these inputs as we can.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we're not going to be changing things like up and down between the menus and in-game.
Right.
Well, we simply want to leave those alone. So we don't want to run into a scenario where we have to take this entire input block we've assembled and duplicate the entire thing for additional maps.
Mm-hmm.
What we'll do is we'll build a kind of input stacking system. We'll change the name of our input block to global input. And we'll add additional input blocks. Actually, let me change that in both the opening and the closing tag. So the idea is we'll have one block which is called global input. Then after global input, we'll add an additional block beginning with game input. And then after game input, we can add one more block, which we will call menu input. And we'll set up a scenario so that when our input system goes to read all of these bindings, we'll actually read global input into both of the final input maps, so into both game input and menu input. So the idea is that anything that would be the same between these two will get put in the global section, so we don't have to bind it twice. Then we only have to address the things that differ between game input and menu input.
Now, are we going to change anything on the keyboard at all, or is this just going to strictly go for the gamepad / drum set?
We're only going to worry about the gamepad. We'll keep the keyboard as a debug device, and again, we already have enough buttons to break up the different functions.
Right. I mean, it makes sense. If you want to move up and down a menu with a keyboard, you're just going to usually subconsciously go right to the arrow keys.
Again, and primarily this is to allow more Rock Band style drum navigation from within a menu. So what we need to do is address the gamepad bindings for our buttons. We've got these series of buttons that allow us to address notes from the gamepad. Now, it's these buttons that we'll be needing to change, especially A, B, X, and Y, where we have A to do things like select in a menu and go forward, B would let you jump back in a menu, X should be the blue drum, so that'll let you move up in a menu, and Y will let you move down. And at this point, they're all bound to notes. So what we need to do is, it is these note bindings that are going to change, so we'll completely move them out of our global input block and paste them into our game input block. Now we'll take just the A, B, X, and Y buttons, we'll copy those, and paste them into menu input. So the idea is that we don't even worry about the button bindings inside of global, and instead we place them into game input and menu input. That way we're free to change what happens with these. So for example, inside of game input, we'll leave the inputs exactly the same. We'll have all of our buttons be bound directly to notes, and then we'll specify the track value. Inside of menu input, we'll change these around so that we can use the various buttons to navigate our menu. So beginning here with the A button, we can set the A button to be bound to select. and that'll let us progress forward through menus. And we can move down here. Next up, we've got the Y button. That should be the yellow drum. So we'll let that move. We can begin with that moving up. We may swap these. We'll swap these if we need to after we test them.
I think when you mentioned it a second ago, you had them swapped from that, but it doesn't really matter because you could try it out either way. And if you're like, actually, I like moving up with this drum instead, it's easy to come in here and just change them out.
Exactly. So we'll drop them down. They may at this point be the reverse of Rock Band. It's just been a while since I played. So
yeah, I really wouldn't worry about it.
So we'll set Y. Yeah, we'll bind Y to up.
Yeah, the key here is to get the functionality in place to swap out your map sets, no matter what you swap them to.
All right, next up we've got the B button. We'll set that to be back, and we can use the red drum to navigate back through menus. And finally we have the X button, which we will bind to down.
Okay.
All right, let's fix up some of our column spacing and pull this. Actually, we'll pull both of these back a little bit, and that keeps everything nicely on screen.
Mm-hmm.
We can also go through the data and zero out all of these. Even though a track value being fed into select back, up, and down isn't going to hurt anything, just to keep the binding file as clean as possible, we'll zero all of these out.
Okay.
So, simple enough. The idea is that we have a base and then additional bindings. Now let's turn our attention to the config class and create the necessary containers to hold this information. So going down here to game, let's bring up config.cs, not beat generator. Inside of config, we're going to add an additional map set. If you remember earlier, we had already created a map set that we're currently using for the game's input, and we called that game maps.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, we're going to make a second map set. So I'll duplicate the map set field and call the new one menu maps. Now let's go down to load input and take a look at what we need to do to get this map all loaded and set up. First, we need to make sure that we instantiate the map set itself. So we need to go here and say menu maps equals new map set. We have new map set instance ready to go. Now we need to address our map loading, and this is where things get a little bit interesting because we need to make sure that global input applies to both game maps and menu maps, whereas the specific sections, game input and menu input, apply only to their respective mappings. So what we'll do is we'll temporarily comment out our one load map set line, because it's load map set that we'll continue to use since load map set can take in a section, so we're free to pass in whatever section we would like. So let's begin. Let's jot down a note of what we're going to be doing. In our first loading, we're going to load global input into all map sets. To do this, we're going to make two calls to load map set. The first one is going to pass in XML config, because of course we're using the same configuration XML file for all of these. And the section is going to be global input. Finally, we need to pass in the map set into which this information will get loaded, and we'll begin with game maps. Now that takes care of getting everything in global input loaded into game maps, but we want to make sure that everything that's within that global section, again, everything up here at the top in global input, we still want all of this to apply in the menu map set and to do the same thing, so that we still have select, up, down, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to take this load map set line and we're going to call it one more time. This way we can load global input into menu maps as well. So at this point, game maps and menu maps will both do the exact same thing. They both have the same bindings in them. Now we'll load the input from the remaining blocks as a second pass. We'll drop down a note saying that we're going to load map specific input. So we can begin with a similar call, load map set, passing in XML config. This time we need to address the section game input. So this is game specific inputs, so we're going to load that into the game maps. And you will note that in our load map set method, if we scroll down here to load map set, you'll notice that we aren't actually clearing out map set. This is why we can continue to add information with multiple calls to load map set.
Okay.
Every time we call load map set, we're going to be adding information to a given map set. Alright, let's take this line and duplicate it. Now we'll run a second load map set line, this time reading menu input, and we're going to make sure we load that input into our menu maps. So now you can kind of see the flow of data. Global input goes into both map sets. Game input goes only into game maps, and menu input goes only into menu maps. And we no longer need our original call to load map set, so we will pull it out entirely. Alright, this will have all of our inputs loaded and ready to go, but now we need to worry about changing the map sets, because whenever we go to a menu screen, we need to make sure that menu maps gets put into play. And whenever we go from a menu into the game, then we need to switch over to our game maps. So what we'll do is first we'll load up our screen menu class. The menus are all very easy to handle here, because screen menu is the base class to all menus, and therefore we can just go into process show and change our input map set from here. So that means we can look at our input class, we can call change map set, and then pass in the maps that we would like. We're in the menu class, so we'll pass config.menuMaps.
Now when any of the screens that derive from the screen menu class come into play, we switch over to the menu style of navigation where drums will move us up and down.
Exactly, and so that way it doesn't matter which menu we're on, we'll always switch to the menu maps. Now in the case of the game screen, game descends directly from screen, so we'll have to go to it specifically. Fortunately, there's fewer of those. At the moment, there's only one. So into screen game, let's scroll up to the top, and let's add an override for process show. And inside of process show, we shouldn't need to worry about our base call. We'll jump right in and put a call to input.changeMapSet, and we'll pass in config.gameMaps. And that should take care of changing us over. So at this point, we should be able to use the drum buttons of A, B, X, and Y to get us through the menus. But once we get through the menus, we should be able to play the game and still use our drum buttons for notes.
Which is cool, because if you're playing with a drum controller, then that means you should never have to put down your drumsticks.
Exactly. So let's load up the game, and let's test this out. Here at a menu, let's see what happens if we hit the X button. Oh, very nice. We can move down.
Nice.
So what happens if we hit the Y button? Oh, we move back up. Alright, so we'll hit X, we'll move down to multiplayer. So this is again just simulating using the actual drum buttons on a drum controller. So to go into multiplayer, instead of hitting the start button for select, we'll hit the A button for our green drum. If we hit green, very nice, we jump in. We could hit X a few times to jump down and select a song. We could hit A again to jump into that song. And now with the song playing, let's watch the notes and see if we can hit some yellow notes. So, very nice.
Seems to be working.
So our game session ends out. If we continue hitting the Y button, our Y drum, we're now interfacing with the menu.
Very cool.
So all is working very well. And again, relatively simplistic, thanks to the input system that's already in place. Again, it was just a matter of setting up a config system that made sense. Here in config XML, you see we have a lot of inputs total, but we gain some efficiency by only separating inputs that are actually different between maps. Then we took a look at our config class to make sure that we bind all of our inputs appropriately, and that takes care of drum menu nav.